People who grew up in neighborhoods controlled by the Mafia, e.g. NY in the 60s, 80s, how was your real daily life influenced? Overall it was pretty good. The neighborhood was always clean and taken care of. NYC sanitation snowplows would clear the streets constantly during a snowstorm. The sanitation workers would manually shovel the sidewalks of our block. Meanwhile, the news is reporting people being snowed in and city plows are not showing up. It wasn't until I got older that this wasn't the norm. Also, guys in bespoke suits hanging out during traditional working hours wasn't a norm as well. My parents would tell me not to go into certain stores or walk on certain streets. At the time I didn't fully grasp the reasoning behind the rules. I thought the guys in bespoke suits were nice since they always would gather kids and family around a Mr. Softy ice cream truck for free desserts during summer evenings. I never saw any beatings or hits. I heard a lot of "get out of here kid, be smart, stay in school and drugs are for weak-minded people." I guess you can say it's more like a Bronx Tale than it was Godfather or Casino. I grew up in the neighborhood where Carlo Gambino had a house and later where John Gotti Jr. lived. It was similar to this. Nothing happened in our neighborhood. They did their thing in the city/away from where they lived. It was hilarious how none of the Mafia guys ever answered their door on Halloween. We learned to not waste our time going to their houses. John Jr. loved July 4th though. He used to give fireworks to all the kids. The parents in our neighborhood hated it, but they weren't going to say anything to him. Totally agree with Up lived in 2 Mafia-owned buildings in NYC in early 90s. Decent security, the garbage was always picked up, the building was okay, I mean they were more responsive than the cops if we had any problems. Yes, I realize that the corruption and crime the Mafia brings is negative for society, but my own personal experience living alongside them was fine. My only experience of violence was a neighborhood corner store that was obviously a money laundering, I don't know what spot, always 2 people working the register despite maybe a dozen items on the shelves, most of which were dusty and old AF, got hit, whoever was working there and whatever they were doing. They're not around anymore. That was like real-world movie stuff. I actually grew up in the Bronx Tale neighborhood, 187th Street on the other side of Mount Carmel Church. I'm 2 years younger than Chaz Palminteri. Never knew him. The only reason I even knew about the mob presence in the neighborhood was my father was a famous boxing champion in Italy and they loved partying with him. Later, after I got married, my wife and I lived in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. As others have said, mob neighborhoods are clean, safe, and they don't bother you if you're not involved in their enterprises. My grandfather ran for political office against a mobster in Jersey back in the day, and while he was out for dinner with my grandmother the next year and got shot up in a drive-by, he had multiple incidents at his home of windows being smashed and threatening notes being left around. He did not win the position. I'm not sure if the mobster did or not, honestly not really sure how it all ended. My mom would never go into too much detail other than it happened and the past is the past. Grew up in Brooklyn in the late 60s early 70s but moved away when I was 9. Only thing I really remember is a guy on our block named Teddy who even then I could tell was some kind of low-level gangster. Drove a Corvette Stingray and when it got stolen one day had a new one in a different color the next day. He also had a dog, a huge terrifyingly fierce German Shepherd that he had either found or raised, but all I know is everyone crossed to the other side of the street when that dog was out front of his brownstone, even though there was a metal fence and it was chained. But the main thing with Teddy was that every July 4th he would completely fill the trunk of his Corvette with firecrackers of all kinds. He used to stand there and let the lady fingers go off in his hand, which was scary but not crazy. And he'd light the normal firecrackers that you definitely didn't want going off in your hand, and he'd hold them for 3 or 4 or 5 seconds and then toss it away with a laugh just as it exploded. He'd do the same thing with cherry bombs that could blow your fingers off. We were amazed. But then eventually he'd bring out the heavy artillery. Something that was called a blockbuster that was supposedly equal to half stick of dynamite. When he lit that thing even he ran away, and you can be sure that if Teddy was running everyone else was running too. The thing left cracks all along the street. Then everyone went over to the schoolyard where he was going to light off a battery that was supposed to be more like 1 full stick or dynamite or 2, but I was too young and, quite smartly, my parents sent me to bed so I never saw that. Overall I'm sure he was a thug of some kind and we all were scared of him but also loved the crazy energy he brought to the block. My other memory of that kind of thing was going down to Hicks Street by the expressway, which was lined with boarded up buildings. A guy was standing out front of one and he'd lift the plywood on a door and we'd climb up a stairway to a room with a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling and 4 to 5 guys surrounded by a mountain of boxes of firecrackers. Me and my friends were like 8 years old and we'd buy packs for 10 cents each with change we'd scrounged from our parents. It was normal but also sort of cool and exciting. We collected so many packs of firecrackers. The whole street went nuts on July 4th. That was Cobble Hill in like 1970. A very different place from now. I grew up in New York, on the other side of the Hudson from the city, and while the presence wasn't like what I imagine it is in the city, it was there. Where we lived, it was a lot of houses that were decently spaced from each other, in the foothills of the Catskills, with a lot of people I called uncle or cousin that came around maybe once every week or two and were amazingly cool to me. They all ate and drank at my aunt's restaurant when they were there. They always had change for me for the jukebox, to go buy a record, or Mad or Cracked or whatever. When I made my first communion, it was a haul. I didn't get it then, but they laid out some bucks buying me all kinds of gold crosses, rings, necklaces with medallions of my patron saint, etc. Every Christmas or birthday was like that. No one broke into houses in our neighborhood, even though there was a problem with that in the general area. Snow plows always hit our streets right away. Even when there was a strike, our garbage got picked up. When my mom was in the hospital with cancer and my dad was visiting her as much as possible, somehow our lawn was always done, meals were delivered to the house daily, laundry was done. I was always looked after by someone. We moved when I was 9, 1979, but years later before my grandma died, she had one of those honest talks with me and laid out how both my mother and father's side of the family were OC back to 1920s and that my dad was basically legit, because his father demanded that. But that said, as an accountant, he still cooked the books for a lot of illegitimate businesses. I also found out then the reason my dad moved us down south then was that I was getting to an age I would soon put things together and he didn't want that. Last I ever saw of any of those people from NY was when my dad passed and two guys not much older than me showed up and gave me an envelope with about $12,000 in it to help with funeral expenses. I said it was covered by insurance, and the one I remember being named Tommy said then keep the scoots for yourself. My mother was a bartender at a restaurant/bar in Boston. Sometimes she would bring me in the late afternoons for a Shirley Temple. I would sit with the men in dapper suits. They were wonderful to me, and loved my mother. They nicknamed her Sonny. They were always genuinely interested in what was going on in my life, school, friends, activities etc. I loved to visit with them and was enamored by their kindness towards my mother. I had never seen such strong men in my life at the time, and wished one of them would be my father. I wasn't aware of their goings-on until I was around 12 years old. I was a night owl, and would eavesdrop on conversations. Her only true confidant was her sister, who worked at the same place. I heard her say that they had offered to kill my father, who had left her when I was a baby but would come over every couple weeks and beat everyone up. She was crying and said she begged them not to hurt him, but they told her they were going to break his knees. My mother killed herself some years later. A time went by, my father had an accident, both his legs below the knees were shattered and he had to retire from the police force. I've always wondered. When my parents divorced, my mother's coworker apparently had ties to Mexico's cartels and they offered to off my father for my mom. They guaranteed her that she wouldn't be tied, followed him and his mistress. They gave her pictures, and basically told her with her word it'd be done. My mother, who is a good person through and through, said no, he isn't worth it. She told me this years after the divorce and I still think about it to this day. My mom has a friend who grew up in around the Winter Hill Gang and even had met Whitey Bulger himself a few times. Luckily for her she never had any family members affected by the gang and they never had any major issues with them. She did also say that they were always nice to her since she happened to be deaf. Crazy how two-sided people can be. The mob ran Youngstown, Ohio for decades. When I was growing up in the 90s is when they started to really getting torn apart. The power vacuum is what is really the weird part. These illegal businesses don't just go away because the ones running it get taken down. So there was a lot of gang violence when I was young as rivals tried to capitalize the drug, gun, and gambling markets. It kinda just became corruption at one point. Public officials/workers getting indicted left and right. Our congressman, Jim Traficant, was embroiled in bribery scandals for the 8th time, only slightly exaggerated. That's when the FBI showed up at my house looking for my dad. He was in Florida and my mom told them to come back with a warrant. I knew we were always around some shady shit. That was the confirmation. I was 13. 2 of his friends went to jail, 2 more indicted, and 1 received immunity to flip. I was 8 when the failed assassination of the county prosecutor happened in '96. That was really the one where I really started to comprehend what Youngstown was. I had heard stories of Youngstown tune-ups, car bombs, and my parents would point out houses in our neighborhood that was bombed or shot up. My dad would tell me about the crazy shit the mob used to pull. And here they just tried to off the DA. Used to? They were doing that shit in real time. Richard Pryor even talked about Youngstown's Mafia. In the late 70s, my mom was coming home from work at a trucking company late one night, and a Youngstown cop pulled her over. He said, "I'm pulling you over because you stopped at that stop sign back there. Don't ever stop for any reason over here this time of night, or I'll write you a ticket." Our house in Warren was broken into 2x over a period of a few years. It was pretty rotten time there in the Mahoning Valley. In the 90s it was still very bad, but as you say, things were more targeted, as it is in most places. Then we moved to Pittsburgh to escape this so that we could see 30 cars get stolen off our street in one night, an attempted break into our place, and other such bullshittery. The late 70s/early 80s were generally miserable everywhere. Basically every urban core in America was awful. I always knew some people in Pittsburgh whose dads always seemed to have money, not an obscene amount, like buy cars outright cash, but never had clear jobs. Always nice guys, but generally meant a few words. There was also some low-level police corruption, too, like officers who took cuts of video poker machines in the back rooms of places, etc. After the 90s, though, you didn't see much of that. Lived next to the Russian Mafia growing up. Anyone who was Russian would always say I know someone, but in reality, there were a lot of lower-tiered people who did collections and these were the people they were talking about. There were fights and you saw people go into stores and just go to the back who obviously didn't work there and you know that store was into shady shit, but it didn't involve you so who cares. There were occasional hits in the neighborhood, but living near Coney Island there was worse violence in the poor areas. If anything, you could walk down the streets at 3 a.m. and not worry because if you were not involved in anything you were left alone and the locals policed themselves. My mom has stories. One was that her best friend growing up, elementary age, lived across the street from a big-name mafia guy who was known for tons of shit but talentedly elusive and the cops could never get him on something. The idea was that someone always had to be writing down his comings and goings, even though they knew they'd be really benign, because this guy knew how to cover his tracks. So the cops had a semi-permanent stakeout for a while that eventually moved inside my mom's best friend's house. To the point where she knew the cops' names and they'd always say hi when my mom went over. The mafia dude would wave at the cops sometimes. Everyone knew what was going on. They still needed those times of entry and departure written down. Edit. Even as I was typing this, I was wondering how real it could be because it's just so insane. But it dawned on me that this was before cameras were cheap. Manpower was cheaper somehow. My parents grew up in Brooklyn, and went to the same high school in the late 70s/early 80s. It was some real Bronx tale, do the right thing type stuff. They talk like it was only black and Italian people there. They said it was mostly causal racism, between both groups really. My dad only had one really bad experience, maybe a few years after he came to the States. But they bring up this guy they went to school with, I'll call him Bob. He'd pull up to the school in the nicest cars, he was loaded, he had well-tailored clothes. His dad was a mob something or other, my parents don't remember. Anyway, Bob was this complete bat that ran with an equally bat crew. Like even the teachers wouldn't f*** with him, it wasn't worth it. One day, his little brother gets in a fight with one of the black kids over a basketball game. The black kid is sick in some way, I can't recall if it was sickle cell or something like that. My dad was in the gym watching. He said what happened wasn't a big deal, but it was two kids trying to be macho in front of their friends. Anyway, it's coming to blows, there's a crowd. The little brother is f***ing the other kid up. It's getting bad. Then, Bob comes up with his crew and he's furious at his kid brother. Like spitting mad. He pulls his brother off, like he's sick. What the f*** is wrong with you? And the little brother is stammering, and the black eye is on the floor. And then, if my dad recalls correctly, Bob slaps his brother, then goes to help the black kid up. He asks if he's okay, and apologizes to him and his friends. Then he makes his little brother apologize. Both my parents remember him as having a code. They say that he's in jail now. Not sure what for. Interestingly, it was only the first of my dad's many experiences with the mob. He said they were very pleasant to him and his family, probably because my grandpa fixed a lot of their television sets.